Despite the adventures aboard the space vessel Starlight Voyager, they were still dangerous and life-threatening far too often for Kraz's liking. Against many strange new threats, from fanatics to giant monsters to a self-proclaimed ruler of space, the red-scaled reptilian had seen more horrors than anyone should. He longed to return home to the Reptilian Union. The humans had a saying about this, calling it a wish on a cursed charm. It was apparently an old expression, the meaning clear but the origin unknown. The meaning was that a wish would be granted, but in a way that made one regret ever making it. His wish to return home was granted through medical leave. Multiple broken bones and serious blood loss had marked Kraz as unfit for duty. His friends and the crew of Starlight Voyager deemed it safer for him to be sent home until he recovered. Where this cursed charm came into play was that he wasn't simply allowed to recover as a war hero admired for his bravery, his size, and his deep red scales. Besides returning to the Voyager once cleared for service, Kraz was required to lecture at the military academy as soon as he was able to leave the hospital. Over generations, multiple academies across various continents on the reptilian home planet of Sothra were united as the three-eyed reptiles expanded into space. Now the multiple sections across continents were all branches of the Sothra Military Academy, the prestigious school that recruited the best from across the Union's territories. Kraz had never been invited to attend Sothra Academy, which made him even more resentful that he was now ordered to lecture at a place that had previously considered itself too good for him. His injuries were no longer life-threatening, downgraded to extremely inconvenient. The broken bones had been set, and the fragments either removed or reattached, so he no longer had to worry about damaged organs from moving around too much. This led the military reptilian to grow restless, which resulted in him being assigned to lecture at Sothra Military Academy. Reptilian lecture halls were similar in shape to human ones. Aside from planets with unusual atmospheric compositions, the laws of acoustics were essentially universal. The professor was an attractive reptilian woman named Hala, only a little older than Kraz himself, quite young for reptilian academia, since he had joined the military as soon as he was able. Her beige scales were bright and healthy, her conical skull coming to a nice feminine point at the back, and her short body was broad to advertise her fertility, showing any potential mate that she could produce a large clutch of eggs. Kraz rolled into the room seated in a tracked mobility chair, since his wounds were still too severe for extended walking. The students immediately made sounds of quiet awe at the sight of him, and the petty officer inwardly preened. He knew he was an impressive specimen. His scales were deep red, an incredibly rare color among his species. His skull came to a broad, shallow point like a gumdrop. He was slimmer than most males, but his sheer height helped make up for that. He was nearly as tall as the average male human. "So, Kraz," Tella began, with a pleasant gurgle to her voice, "you've been assigned to a role in the human space exploration fleet. Could you tell us a little about what that's like?" Kraz tipped his head back to the right in his people's equivalent of a self-effacing smirk. Reptilian mouths did not lend themselves to subtle gestures, and they could only bare their teeth when it was time to bite. In a word, terrifying. His voice was a deep growl, or maybe horrifying is better. Sina went on a tangent about the difference once. Apparently, terror is the anticipation of something frightening, while horror is when you actually experience it. He paused, realizing he'd gotten ahead of himself. To start from the beginning, I've been assigned to a human vessel called Starlight Voyager. It's named after the tool of an explorer from human myth. It's what humans call a hab ship, meaning a starship capable of self-sustainment. The Voyager has an elaborate hydroponic system allowing it to provide food, water, and oxygen for its crew. We supplement the bland food with normal rations, but if we ran out of supplies, we could theoretically sustain indefinitely. Starlight Voyager is under the command of Captain Mason Blake. He's a male human. Kraz took a moment to look out at the class. So many trios of young, bright eyes staring back at him. You've all seen images of humans, right? At the gentle murmurs of agreement, he continued. Blake. Kraz paused again. Human naming conventions are strange. They typically have two names, which they share with relative freedom. The first name is personal, while the second identifies the family to which the human belongs. On human ships, we typically address humans by their family name. He took a moment to recall where he'd left off. The captain takes what he calls a hands-on approach to leadership. He can often be found conversing in person with those he wants to communicate with, despite humans having the same distance communication tools as the rest of us. Honestly, they take their communications to another level. Each human has a personal communicator at their hip. I've seen this in humans outside the Voyager as well, but Blake prefers to meet in person when possible. So often you'll see him wandering the ship. Kraz chuckled, mostly to himself. The first time I saw him moving, I thought I had done something wrong, or we were in danger. The captain has a way of stalking through the corridors like he's on his way to attack something. But that's just how he moves. It sounds intimidating, Taylor observed. It can be, Kraz admitted. All humans are imposing in their own way, how they casually ignore extremes of temperature or their skill in combat. But they're also often disarmingly friendly. Humans are earnest in a way that's difficult to express. I've seen the captain employ great duplicity in negotiations. It's not that they can't lie or don't understand deception, but I think the danger of their daily lives leads them to value honesty and straightforwardness in a way we might not. The injured reptilian took a breath. Blake's executive officer is a man named Frost, and the commander is a harder man than Blake. Not a bad person, but... He paused, trying to find the right words. Perhaps sharper is a fair term. Blake has a natural aggression to him, but one not directed at his crew. Frost is stern, always watching for signs of weakness or disloyalty. There were murmurs among the students. These humans were sounding more and more dangerous. It took me a while to accept Lieutenant Sina, Kraz continued. She is, in many ways, her commander's opposite. She's soft, gentle, a clutch mother, as you might say. It felt a poor fit to have her aboard a military vessel. However, on my first mission with the Voyager, she was instrumental in a smooth victory. Sina is unconventional, and her kindness helps to counterbalance Frost. A student near the back spoke up. Is it true that humans live in fire? Kraz's left and right eyes dilated in brief confusion. Not as far as I know, but it is true that humans have incredible durability in different environments and conditions. They can endure cold that would cause irreparable damage to us, but can also live comfortably in temperatures we would consider warm. That was a shock to the students. Academically, most knew humans were resilient and lived on many planets, but having it spelled out like that was still impressive. That's part of the reason why those who work on human ships have to be carefully vetted. Kraz continued, and why no non-human has yet set foot on Earth. The comfortable temperature for humans aboard the Starlight Voyager is dangerously close to being too cold for my good health, while our avian engineer finds it uncomfortably warm. Tella glanced over with her leftmost eye. The humans have an avian on their crew. Humans' animosity with the cold-weather avians was well known. The Avian Federation had a war machine that had conquered all individual stellar nations until it encountered a barely spacefaring human commonwealth. The two militaries fought to a standstill, and debate continued about whether humans would have won had the war continued. Kraz chuckled. I was surprised too when I first heard about it. Miva isn't a Federation native though. Her parents were refugees and raised her in insectoid space. That was essentially all the explanation needed. The beetle-like insectoids were strange to the rest of the galaxy, and someone raised among them wouldn't behave like warmongering avians. Professor Tella addressed Kraz again. For those who might aspire to work on a human ship, what is the average day like? Kraz spread his arms. Well, honestly, it's not terribly different from most other vessels. It's more unique living on a HAB ship than working with humans. One notable thing about humans is that they're quick to form cliques. These aren't necessarily exclusionary, but humans love to form or adopt small tribes. Usually, these cliques form out of proximity, such as engineers assembling into one. But that's not guaranteed. Each little group will have its own inside jokes and behavioral conventions, so you need to learn how to navigate these, keeping to standard human attitudes until you seem welcome to use the clique's terms, and familiarity is generally the best approach. The injured lecturer took a moment to remember where he'd left off before the question sent him on a different tangent. So you asked what life was like, and I said horrifying. To elaborate, I don't think my experience was normal. At least I hope it wasn't. My first mission, which was intended as a simple shakedown operation, turned into a battle to stop a cult and rescue captives. Very few operations went smoothly without some surprise or twist. We fight for our lives, and many people lose theirs. The humans are hardy, but they can't fix everything. A girl in the middle of the crowd, with scales so pale they were nearly gray, spoke up. What was the scariest situation you found yourself in? Kraz took a moment to consider. There are many candidates, and I know how awful that sounds. I've probably been in worse scrapes since, but the sheer panic of being chased by a giant monster stands out as the most terrifying. We crash-landed on a Deathworld in the southeastern fringe. He elaborated, and already saw students wince. The Galactic Southeast was lawless territory, populated almost entirely by pirates, warlords, and madmen. It was unknown if there were sapient species in that nebula-choked mass of stars, but the discovery of humans at the edge of the fringe, and the revelation that these mammals lived on a world with a molten core and were intimately familiar with Deathworld horrors, had caused many stellar cartographers to reissue their galactic maps with the classic "Here be monsters" line over the vague mass of the Galactic Southeast. To shorten a long story, I found myself being hunted by a gigantic insectoid monster, easily the size of a small freighter. The mention of a beast the size of a two-story home was even more unsettling. It tore open my back, and if it hadn't been for Jax's first aid spray, I'd likely be dead. As it was, I had to lie there while the humans killed the thing. Was that what left you so injured? The girl asked, clearly meaning his current state. Kraz gave a quick jerk of his head in the negative. No, that was many months ago now, I think, if not longer. Time tends to blur on deployment, especially aboard a ship that doesn't actually need to restock its supplies. A student near the front, a young male with brown scales, politely raised his hand. On the subject of injuries, I've heard rumors about humans living through impossible things. Have you seen anything like that? Kraz tilted back his head in another smirk. You have to be more specific, he quipped, continuing before the boy could refine his question. I've seen humans do insane things and heard tales of far more. One that I witnessed, which stands out to me, had to do with Captain Blake himself. When we fought that giant monster, it hit him in the leg, and Blake was limping until we got back to the ship, where the medic explained that his knee had been dislocated. The joint had been completely forced out of the socket. He explained to horrified gasps and murmurs. Reptilians were sturdy but not flexible at all. The idea of a joint being ripped from its socket meant, to a reptilian, a crippling injury with only the slightest chance of healing. The medical officer wrenched the captain's knee back into place, and after a night's rest where he didn't strain it, Blake was walking around good as new. Kraz finished. The student was stunned. How is that possible? The red reptilian tapped his chin to his left shoulder in a shrug. Humans are flexible, more so than most species. Their tendons and ligaments can stretch to degrees that would be devastating to other species, and they seem built to pop their joints back into place. He clenched his teeth in a grimace, remembering how Lieutenant Cena's smooth flexibility had allowed her to stand from a stealthy crawl when his more limited range of motion had forced him to walk his hands up a wall to stand. Without fanfare, when I asked about it, nearly everyone on the crew had a story of a dislocated joint, usually of the shoulder, but sometimes the hip. The knee is apparently rare to dislocate, but it's still fixable. Another student spoke up. Was that the worst injury you saw? Kraz gave his head a brief side-to-side jerk. No. The worst injuries were probably the deaths in the crash that led to that fight. But if you're asking about survivable injuries, still no. He took another breath. One of the worst I saw personally was with Brick, one of the Marines, the biggest man on the cruiser by a fair margin. Brick was also an adrenaline junkie who saw out combat as his drug of choice. I still don't know exactly what they were doing, but a few of the Marines and crew were playing some sort of game in one of the bays. Apparently, someone bumped something he shouldn't have, and one of the shuttles started rotating. The wing caught Brick in the leg, bent it at a bizarre angle, and the bone in his upper leg broke in half. It was so bad that the splintered bone tore through his skin and jutted up through his thigh. A collective shudder went through the class as they envisioned the injury. Did he have to go on convalescent leave? The student asked, since Kraz had said this was not a lethal injury. Nobody had to ask if the Marine had died, but it still sounded awful. Amazingly, no, the red reptilian replied. Humans keep first aid spray on hand pretty much everywhere. It's some sort of aerosolized sealant that keeps blood in and particulates out. It certainly saved my life when that monster tore my back open. If Jax hadn't used some to stop my bleeding, I'd unlikely be alive today, he added as an aside. They sprayed over Brick's wound, called for a stretcher, and took him to the medical bay. There, the medic dissolved the spray and grabbed the bone, wrenching it back into place. He motioned with his hands to emphasize how this might have happened, clutching at some imaginary protrusion and forcing it down. Another collective wince went through more than half of the crowd, the remainder in disbelief and unable to accept such a thing was real. And then he used organic glue to bond the bone together, sealed the wound, and put Brick in a cast before calling him an idiot. He was unable to work for about a month, and we all made fun of him. A collective laugh rose up from the crowd. The question about fire earlier did remind me. Kraz mused about Jax. Most human military personnel have at least a few scars, but Jax seems to be more scar tissue than undisturbed skin. He's not much older than the rest of the Marines, so I don't know if he's incredibly fortunate to have survived all those things, or incredibly unlucky to have gotten into all that trouble in the first place. He took a breath. I haven't asked about all of his injuries. Just feels rude, as though I'd be treating him like an exhibit, but his voice is raspy from fire damage. The worst thing is to hear him tell it. He got the injury while on leave. That statement seemed to have the class on the edge of their seats, so Kraz continued. Jax was looking forward to some much-needed time off. The war against the Avian Federation was over, and he had lost too many friends to the birds. While he had re-enlisted, he was thankful that he wouldn't have to fight anymore in the aftermath of the war. Humanity had earned respect and the chance for friendship among the stars. Already, the higher-ups in the Space Exploration Force were preparing to travel into galactic neutral territory to discuss colonization rights, wanting to go through all the proper channels to reinforce that humans were good neighbors when given no cause to be bad ones. The politicking had no real interest to Jax. He simply wanted to relax with a nice leave from this SEF. He secured a hotel aboard the Tensai habitat orbiting Saturn. He could spend some much-needed time just decompressing, celebrating, and indulging in basic human pleasures. He got to his hotel, unpacked his luggage, and changed into a nice outfit. The dark gray jacket went well with his close-shorn brown hair and chocolate eyes, and it didn't make his skin look too pale by comparison. His scars still made themselves known, but he just had to live with them. They make good conversation starters in some cases, and the adage holds true far more often than not. Females appreciate scars. He headed downstairs and ordered some drinks at the hotel bar, getting pleasantly buzzed before properly setting out for a night in town. Out in the void of space, a minor chunk of an avian warship spiraled through the blackness. For the most part, salvage efforts had cleaned up the debris for recycling and study, as much as for safety, but in the aftermath of a war, pieces could go missing in the sheer vastness of outer space. In any other situation, this would have no impact. Every station and habitat had a network of rail cannons to destroy approaching space debris. This particular debris, however, was a chunk of starship including its exterior plating. The automated weapons performed their duty, identifying that the approaching object was not a spacefaring vessel, and then opening fire. But rather than breaking the offending debris into so much space dust, the shots sheared it apart. Most of the metal was eventually destroyed, but a shard of the structural support beam hurtled toward the space station like a spear. Alarms blared across Tensei as the fragment caught in Saturn's gravity and accelerated toward the habitat. Despite the fact that the habitat ceilings displayed an artificial sky, everyone reflexively looked up. The ceiling burst open, the piece of superstructure driving through the station's plating like a tack, and then violent decompression ripped it back out. Air surged out of the habitat section with such force that people and objects were pulled from the ground and funneled toward the breach. In the moments between the impact and the deployment of the bulkheads to cut off the rupture, people and vehicles had been pulled high into the air. Smaller structures were ripped from their foundations. Accelerant dripping from torn pipes met with active electrical wires and spawned fast-spreading fires. It was as much luck as skill and instinct that saved Jax's life. The sturdy veteran grabbed for the nearest big object, clinging to a truck and crawling alongside it as the vehicle spiraled through the air. When the vacuum suction cut out, he leaped onto a nearby building rather than riding the truck back down to certain death. The building on which he found himself, however, was in an unhealthy state. He could smell and hear fire, and screams for help rose from within. To stay at the top was a death sentence, as response teams would have far bigger problems to deal with than plucking a single man off the roof of a burning restaurant. Jax would have to brave the flames and get out before they became impenetrable. He threw himself against the rooftop access door several times before it finally gave way. His curse turned into an aborted yelp as he had to ride the door like a sled down a flight of stairs. There was no way this place was up to code, he thought. The door hit the wall at the bottom of the stairs, which meant that he subsequently hit the wall, only barely managing to turn and impact with his back rather than his head and neck. He staggered out into a forked hallway, wandering into the kitchen from there. He presumed the double doors led to the dining area. Several of the ovens had been damaged by falling debris ripping through the wall, and fire blazed along the side of the kitchen. The screams had mostly died down, likely people filtering out, but he could still hear a single high-pitched shriek coming from the dining area. Giving the flames a wide berth, Jax pushed open the doors to find a conflagration engulfing much of the area. He couldn't presume to know how it traveled from the kitchen, or if these had been concurrent fires, and honestly, he didn't much care. He could hear a child's voice, a young girl. "Please, please," she wailed. "Anybody. My dad's trapped." Jax staggered forward, coughing into the smoke. He shucked his jacket and wrapped it around his face. It wasn't as good as a soaked shirt, but anything would do to filter out the particulates. "Where are you?" "I'm coming." "Over here," the girl shrieked. "By the bar." Jax found a blonde-haired young girl, probably younger than 10, with the even light tan of living under ultraviolet habitat lighting. She was crouching down to avoid the cloying smoke overhead, struggling against a fallen ceiling. Some of the upper structure had collapsed, burying several people beneath it, but the girl was focused on a pair of legs that were still twitching. "Stand back. I need to get around this, and I don't want to step on you," he warned the girl. Jax studied how the ceiling structure had come down and the angle at which it lay. "All right, I need you to be strong, girl," he said to her. "When I lift this, grab your dad's leg and pull with all your might. You've got to drag him out of here, and don't you dare give up, even if it feels like your bones are breaking, until I say so." "Okay." The girl nodded, bright green eyes shining with tears. The scared military man squatted down and worked his fingers under the frame. His groan of effort rose into a roar of exertion as he lifted the enormous weight. The girl mirrored him, letting out a ragged, eardrum-rattling scream as she clutched her father's ankle and pulled. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the man moved. He'd been pinned awkwardly, and when his first arm came free, her father proved he was still alive and conscious by grabbing for purchase and helping his daughter pull him free. Finally, Jax let the mass drop, collapsing onto his backside and panting for air. "You okay, man?" he asked the father. The other man, who had brown hair and blue eyes, wheezed. His eyes widened in distress, and panic worsened the situation. Having seen similar situations before, Jax quickly diagnosed it. "Lay on your back again. Your windpipe's been crushed. You keep wheezing like that, and you'll close it completely. Just focus on slow, shallow breaths." Jax would need to perform a field tracheotomy. Thankfully, the bar would likely have a metal stirring straw. He climbed over the debris and began shuffling through the detritus behind the bar for his prize. Too late, he noticed the hissing noise of a gas pipe breaking. In a panic, Jax grabbed for a handful of simple plastic straws instead and tried to leap backwards, but the gas was already igniting. A stream of fire like a dragon's breath washed over him, flooding his face. He reflexively closed his eyes and gasped in pain, letting the flame rush down his throat like a pack of ravenous hounds, clawing and biting at everything. Eyebrows and most of what little hair he had seared off. Jax staggered back to the man and child, coughing and shaking. It was his turn to wheeze. His vocal cords wouldn't work, too raw and ragged from the scouring fire. He dropped to his knees and drew his field knife, gesturing with knife and straw, hoping the man would understand. The father looked frightened, tears of anxiety beating at the corners of his eyes, but he gave a thumbs up and gave his daughter a brave smile. "Good man," Jax thought. Jax gestured to himself, taking a deep breath, waiting for the man to follow, then gave a motion he hoped the man would interpret as "hold it." The veteran lightly jabbed the knife just above the curve of the man's sternum, piercing the flesh and causing blood to well, then wedged the straw into the opening. He pinched it with 2 fingers to gently hold it in place, then theatrically exhaled, gesturing for his impromptu patient to do the same. A spattering of blood shot out the straw. Jax smiled and nodded. With the father taking weak but steady breaths, Jax looped one of the man's arms around his shoulders and carried him out. The father's other hand was occupied with holding his daughter's. Professor Tella was the first to react when Kraz finished recounting Jax's story. "That's incredible," she murmured. "We hear stories about how humans survive on a death world, but it's just so far outside our realm of expertise. Stories like this help us better understand exactly what it means that humans are a death world species." Kraz chuckled softly. "That's not the conclusion I drew from that, Professor. Although by the first time I heard it, I'd lived among humans for several months." The beige-scaled professor tilted her head, silently requesting the red reptilian to continue his train of thought. "For humans, life ends more often, and in more disturbing ways than most of us could imagine. I don't ask about Earth's predators or cataclysms anymore." Kraz shook his head. It would be easy to hear all these things about humans and conclude that they are grim people, careless of death because it happens so often. The way they plan for mass death, we could decide that they consider life to be cheap. But from what I've seen, that is not the case. Humans value life in themselves and others. They prepare for mass deaths because they see it as inevitable, and they'd rather as few as possible die, rather than losing everyone in a desperate attempt to save everyone. It was particularly resonant because almost everyone knew of a space station or habitat that had been recently refitted to conform to human standards. Human stations had multiple failure points designed to break off and sacrifice a portion of the structure to save the rest. A student raised her hand. "How does that reconcile with stories from the war? I know the avians were on the other side, so there's going to be some bias. But there are stories of humans just slaughtering their way through enemy lines, shooting to kill every time, using devastating weaponry for maximum death. How does that align with the humans you portray, who value life?" Kraz tilted back his head in a smirk. I had the same question in my mind after I watched them utterly massacre that cult. It was a slaughter, no quarter given. How could I square that human idiom with the humans who'd spend so much time ensuring that Neva and I were healthy? And I think I figured it out. See, I said before that humans value life. In a sense, to humans, life is a currency to be spent. In general, they want to make sure that their lives and those of others aren't spent frivolously. But, well, if someone else wants to try ending your life, then you can ensure that he spends his own life as cheaply as possible. From there, the lecture hall fell into a pattern of theorizing about human values, with Kraz, for the most part, being stumped. Eventually, the class came to an end, and the Red Reptilian was allowed to return to the hospital, away from Sothra Military Academy. He never did manage to get Professor Tella's contact information.